Continuing from the last video, wanted to kind of review the lead up to the critical period from 1763 to 1776, essentially. We talked about the economic philosophy of the British Empire, mercantilism, and how trade was strictly controlled so that imposts, different tariffs and fees could be collected at certain points, and that so that the empire could control from a central point what goods were coming in and out. The book that I use to discuss this is, I've referenced it before, but it's the, I'll put it up here, The Origins of the American Revolution by John C. Miller, 1943. This book can be found on Amazon as a used book. You'll have to look around and find a place you want to buy it if you want to acquire it that way. But it's an excellent book, and some of the reviews on Amazon sort of concur with that. It's probably one of the better ones you're ever going to find in terms of the way it's written. There are other books with more raw information perhaps, but this one does a good job of taking source information and melding it in with the narrative and the way that the author describes what happened. Really, the revolution was really the culmination of a process that had been going on for 100 years. It was really a slow burn. What was happening in 1660 and what was happening in 1776, it was a lot of the same kinds of things, but it was a slow acceleration. So there were certain laws and certain compromises that were made by the British government with the colonies in terms of the enforcement of these navigation and trade merchant rules. There were also pushback against the British or the royal governor and the royal council, and over time a lot of compromises and oversights were kind of ignored, and so you had this salutary neglect period where there wasn't really any major issue happening. But in the meantime, the royal prerogatives in terms of the governor, in terms of the conformance to trade rules, was slowly eroding over time, and the power of the council, which was chosen to assist, it was really the council to the governor, which is chosen by the prerogative of the crown, was actually its power was eroded too over time, and it was also became a well, both the governor and the council became politically weakened over time for a variety of reasons, and this just kept getting worse and worse and worse over time. From the British point of view, from the American point of view, they were gaining liberty, they were gaining latitude to do the things they needed to do and things that they felt were in their own welfare. And so there wasn't really a conflict. There were periods where there were some debates about certain things, but it wasn't a major problem. The governor, often was chosen as, this was not a plum assignment. It was a very contentious, difficult assignment, and most people didn't want the job. People that would come over would be young people or sort of administrative dullards, kind of people that didn't have much other good options. But it was really probably one of the most difficult jobs in the entire empire, was to deal with this political issue of the colonists with the assembly and the council and the governor, and trying to deal with any kind of differences there were between what the crown may want and what the assembly and what the colonies actually were willing to do. And it was a constant problem of trying to find some balance there, and a lot of these governors did not have the diplomatic skill to perform that job very well. Like I say, they were not necessarily the most capable, the most elegant kind of operatives in those roles. the governor had formal power, but his political power was fairly weakened over this period of time, like I mentioned. And after 1763, it was at a point where the crown wanted to, for various reasons, which I mentioned last time, after the French and Indian War and the issues that came up with requisitions of funding and resources and manpower for the war, and the Americans basically refusing to do so. All this is covered in much more detail, and there's much more texture in the book. I'm only trying to provide a general idea of the kind of information that's there, and I really recommend reading this kind of material to understand and get the real feeling for what was happening. But in any case, in 1763, it had reached a point where the crown wanted the governor to assert his authority and to enforce the rules that they had, and maybe even enforce further rules. But here you had, after many decades, in fact, in some sense, maybe a century, where these rules had been basically looked at as passé, irrelevant, de facto, nullified in sort of a de facto way. This is not that much different than we have now. We have really violations of the constitutional structure all over the place in the federal government. One area is the administrative branch. So you have under the executive branch, you've got all of this authority that has been thrown over the wall from the legislative branch, because they don't want to do the work of dealing with every law and every regulation and all the things that are coming out. So they pass these generic kinds of laws that will implement a certain kind of agency or a certain kind of department or whatever, like the EPA or the Department of Interior, the Department of Energy, and so on. There's dozens of them. And then they basically say, okay, they give them a general mandate. They give that to the executive branch, and then thousands upon thousands of laws or essentially regulations, which have the force of law, are created by these agencies every year, and by these departments and bureaus. And really, by these laws have the force of, they have coercive force, and yet they are not actually passed by Congress, which is itself a violation of the Constitution, a breach of the Constitution, because we don't have good direct recourse if these executive branch agencies and departments and bureaus are violating our rights or violating, doing something that we feel is wrong. They pretty much can say, we don't care. We'll just go to the Supreme Court, or we'll go to the judiciary, to the appellate courts, and they'll always give deference to the executive branch, and we, the people, basically lose. So this is the kind of thing that had been happening on the other side of the spectrum. So Britain had been losing prerogatives and royal prerogatives in terms of what the governor would do and could do from a political standpoint, as the council itself would, as opposed to, and then the assembly, the popular elected assemblies, were gaining power, gaining prerogatives, and basically accumulating power over a long period of time, although it accelerated in the last 15 years before the Declaration of Independence. So the council, again, like I say, was appointed by the crown in the sense that it was under the authority of the crown. It was essentially people would be selected based on favoritism, based on political factors and other things such as we see today. These were considered sort of feathers in the hat of certain merchants or large plantation owners and things like this. So these are the people. They would pick people that would do what they wanted and vote the way they wanted, and this didn't always happen. These people were Americans, colonists, and they ended up sort of in the same situation in the middle between the people and the assembly and what the crown wanted. So the council became weakened over time as well. One of the things that there was a big fight about was something called the civil list. So over time, the council or the assembly had gained the prerogative of controlling the budget, controlling the expenditures, and deciding what would be spent on what. This was actually a big giving away of power by the crown, but it was something that they managed to persuade or to coerce the crown or the governor into acceding to. This civil list was essentially a way of permanently fixing salaries at some level that they wanted for the governor and for the other certain positions in the royal government part of the colony. And this battle was fought out for some time. The Americans essentially rebelled, said we are not going to go along with this plan, and essentially the crown gave up. So it was a political loss by the crown, and it showed that there was weakness not only on the part of the council and the governor, but the Board of Trade and Plantations was another entity, and sort of like a federal department, which would deal with the enforcement of rules and the enforcement of laws pertaining to trade and pertaining to the things that the crown had the prerogatives of. And this organization was in a sort of pissing contest with other political factors back in England, and so they didn't have the kind of authority or the kind of political clout to do the things that they should have been doing as well. So again, all of these things factored in to weaken the crown and to strengthen essentially the power or the things that the assembly and the colonists could do. Also, in the assembly was a popular elected body, so people voted, and not everybody could vote. There was criteria, you had to be a landowner and you had to have certain assets. I don't know the details off the top of my head, but it was a popular elected body. In any case, for about 40 years, it had been assumed that the crown did not have the authority to tax people. That was established some 40 years before 1763. But there was also, the Parliament did have the power to tax or to impose taxes, but this had never been exercised, and it was another one of these de facto situations where they've never done it. It's pretty much agreed on they shouldn't be doing it. This is the way it's done now, and so taxes were never levied by Britain directly on the colonies. In 1764, again, we're getting this acceleration of tension and conflict. The crown decided that they wanted to start to exercise their authority in a more affirmative way. And what they started to do and tried to do was, in various ways, was looked at as an arbitrary use of power. So it would be sort of like the president today coming in and saying arbitrarily, I'm going to disband the Department of the Interior, the Department of Energy, the Department of Education. He's just going to start getting rid of all of these things. Or, it might be a case where Congress, there might be a battle there on whether, there's laws that, that branch has to deal with. But if Congress came in and defunded, just flat out defunded all these agencies in sort of a arbitrary manner without dealing with any kind of transition or anything else, you would have an uproar. You would have huge political sort of explosion, because these things are institutionalized, embedded into the fabric of government and the fabric of laws and the administration of these various areas, whether it's education or power or whatever it may be, or the land use policies. So just to come in now and say we are going to start passing taxes, we are going to start enforcing, impost regulations and so on. This was something that was really shocking to the people at that time. This was just a complete turnaround from where things were. The official policy of England was the royal will, as expressed by the king, and the king would have commissions, and the commissions would tell the governor what his will was. This was the supreme law. This was not something that could be challenged or arbitrated or anything. And so increasingly the king, prerogatives of the king were being seen as more assertively exercised. And again, this was a further insult to the idea that the people had certain prerogatives and liberties, and now those were being taken away, were being perceived as a tyrannical kind of move. Again, the governor had the power to veto assembly bills, but again, you had a conflict. The governor being in the middle, he would be in a position where he either has to veto a certain bill in order to comply with the will of the king, or he had to to please the king, or he'd have to please the people politically by letting certain bills pass that really he shouldn't let pass. And as I mentioned, there was more of an inclination to protect himself. In fact, toward the end, the governors became such, because they were being compelled to do certain things on the behalf of the crown, they were chased out. I mean, they actually had to leave the country, or they had to go to some ship and live offshore. I mean, these people were fearing for their lives, so this was not a trivial situation for them. So like I mentioned, the Parliament from decided to start to implement taxes, and then there was a period of sort of a cooling off, and then there was sort of a quiet period from somewhere around 1764. You had pushback and you had conflict, but you really didn't have a re-explosion until 1773. And next time I'll talk more about that next phase in the transition towards the revolution. But when you got to the point where you were at the Tea Party, that was really the sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. There were a whole lot of things that went into that preceded that event, and a lot of things that happened immediately after that event. Although it still took about a year, it took 12 months for certain things to happen. But nonetheless, once the Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party, happened, the wheels were in motion towards a direct armed conflict. And but what was happening between 1764 and 1776? That's about a 10-year period, I suppose, something like that, 12-year period. I'll spend a little bit more time in a subsequent video, not in this segment here, but I'll talk about that separately and go into a little bit of what happened during that period of time, because there's an awful lot of developments and things that happened in that period of time which sort of explain what happened at the Boston Tea Party.